Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
My name is Rick Heemstra, and I'm one of the hosts of the Faith Trends Podcast. We're changing things up for this episode where the regular hosts, Lindsay Calloway and I, will be interviewed by Karen Stiller about how evangelical populations are found by researchers. If you're an evangelical, or you think you might know one or two, I hope at the end of this podcast that you have a better sense of how difficult it is to define evangelical and why it's important we do this well.
So Rick and Lindsay, what is the Christian Evangelical Scale and why do we need it?
The Christian Evangelical Scale is a way to identify evangelicals on polls. So it was developed by Andrew Grenville in the early 1990s. And I think what precipitated that was that there were some evangelicals that were becoming prominent in federal politics, and people wanted to know, who are these people and what are they up to?
So one thing that has always made me, if I get really thinking about this stuff, I do find myself wondering why these labels matter within Christendom. And I know there's a good, simple answer, but please remind me why it's important to be able to say they're an evangelical and they aren't.
From a research point of view, we want to have a fair bit of confidence about who we're talking about. We need to identify research populations. It's important to us for that reason as researchers. But I also think that once people start talking about evangelicals, the people that get identified by them on polls, they represent us and they shape how people think about us. And when we're doing ministry research, this shapes how people make ministry decisions because we're learning about evangelicals, and the answers that we get form the kind of ministry decisions that we make.
So Lindsay, if I can ask you, how do you personally define evangelicals?
This is such a hard question, Karen. It's difficult. So the way that researchers tend to approach this question is, are we going to identify and define evangelicals by the historical movement that they're coming from? Are we going to define them by doctrinal beliefs or certain behaviors? Are we going to just ask them, do you identify with this term? So I think for me, as I've been interacting with a lot of historians, actually, I like the idea that an evangelical is an Orthodox Protestant with some historic ties to the 17th, 18th century revivalist movements. And then I do think that there is this reverence for and a recognition of the authority of the Bible on life and practice. So there are going to be distinct beliefs and distinct behaviors, I think, that would characterize an evangelical. But I think that the historical and the sort of the Protestant marks are also important, because without those, I think that reverence for the Bible and certain behaviors, you could find that in a lot of other religious groups as well.
Yeah, so I have this idea, and it could be completely wrong, that historically evangelicals might have been a little cooler than they are right now in terms of reputation and, I guess, belief and behavior. But is that true, do you think?
Well, in terms of whether we're cooler or not, I think that there was a time when we were more in sync with the culture and the age. So evangelicalism begins as a movement in sort of the 18th century, and evangelicalism was responding to things like the Industrial Revolution and its effect on people's lives. And there was a real big push, say, within Methodism and other evangelical movements to address people's real needs in their lives as the problems of the day sort of overwhelmed them. I think at the time, too, we also took on some of the ways of thinking about the world. So it was a time of empiricism, a belief in both the knowability of the world through our senses, but it was also a time when people started talking about feelings and feeling as a way of knowing. And this was stuff that we incorporated into our language, and some of those cultural assumptions worked very well with evangelicalism. Sometimes we talk about it as a modern movement, modern meaning the period that we talk about as modernism, not what is current. evangelicalism really was a modern movement. I think today, it's not just that we are postmodern with all that means. I think we're probably as a culture moving even beyond that. And so there is not this alignment with, I was about to say the DNA, but that's probably not the right word either. But there isn't this alignment between our culture and the dominant culture in Canada today.
And that makes me think of, the reputation of evangelicals and maybe why some people might not readily identify themselves as evangelicals, even though their beliefs might tick off all the boxes. So, if that's true, and maybe you can answer that, are people reluctant to say, I'm an evangelical, even on a confidential survey? And then if so, like, how do you accurately count or identify evangelicals?
Well, I think that's the problem, really, and that's what is bringing us to this topic today is we're really trying to explore how effective are definitions. How is this word being understood, this label? I actually had a former professor of mine said that she now claims the label evangelical as an act of rebellion, because there is sort of this changing idea, or this representation of what an evangelical is. And then when you try to measure that on a survey with a certain amount of questions, because we are limited in how much time and space we can take up on a survey, who are we really finding? And I guess for me, coming probably from a generation that is increasingly rejecting the label, especially in response to some cultural events that have happened in the last few years, it's a good time to be thinking about the terms that we are using and maybe the collective definition and dictionary that we're all using. And are we actually referring to the same thing when we use the term evangelical? Is it helpful? And if it's not, what are the alternatives? And what, as researchers, are we going to be looking for and measuring?
And I think that a term like evangelical is always culturally situated. It has negative connotations in our cultural situation, but in many parts of the world today, it has very positive connotations. In the majority world, generally, it's a positive term. And certainly historically, like we were just talking about, it was a positive term. It was a term that measurably and demonstrably made people's lives better, and was probably the dominant way of thinking about Protestantism in Canada up to the Victorian era. So, a problem that we get to, when we're talking about how do we find evangelicals on surveys, and that's a process that we call operationalization. That's a big mouthful. But, we can ask people about whether they're an evangelical, whether they self-identify. We can ask them a series of questions about beliefs and behaviors. And that's something like the Christian Evangelical Scale. Or we can ask them about their religious affiliation and decide, ahead of time which churches or denominations belong to the evangelical movement, and their strengths and weaknesses to every approach.
So let's talk about belief and behavior. How do they work together in regards to the work you're doing, and how do those categories help us think about what it means to be evangelical, like in our own lives and churches?
Well, if you look at most statements of faith, most of them for evangelicals will have a statement about the Bible and its authority for life and practice. So there's this idea that what you believe is going to impact how you behave. And for evangelicals, largely what they believe and how they behave is going to be dictated by the Bible. And so along the lines of Sam Reimer, we call this an external locus of authority. We are holding up the Bible as our standard. Now, how they relate to each other, though, is some people will behave in certain ways that might look like evangelical behaviors, but they might not have the same beliefs as evangelicals. So there's that dichotomy. We're also noticing that some people will profess evangelical belief, but their behaviors do not look like evangelical behaviors. And so we're seeing that maybe just a profession of belief or affirming certain doctrinal statements doesn't identify a group of people that is actually living out what they say to believe, that they believe. And sociologists are calling this, actually, they call it performative, that their belief statements serve this performative function. And it's not this sort of attention-seeking kind of performance, but it's essentially saying that they're signaling their allegiance to these beliefs, even though their behaviors are not necessarily aligning with them.
And maybe just a clarification, it may be more signaling not their allegiance to the beliefs, but allegiance to the people who believe that way. There's a lot of discussion about, you maybe hear people talk about believing, behaving, and belonging. And denominations are sort of switching up the order of that triad. And increasingly, denominations are putting the emphasis on belonging as sort of the first step, whereas in the past, belonging may have come at the end of, you believe, then you learn to behave, and then finally we let you belong. And the order has been switched up in our culture now.
Which seems nice to me. Like, I know my church, I think, would have that posture. You can belong before you believe, and then the believing will hopefully be nurtured through the belonging. So, Lindsay, when we talk about beliefs and behavior, it almost sounds like we're talking about a third party looking at someone and hearing that they believe certain things, but then watching how they behave. And then we're kind of categorizing them based almost more on behavior. It feels, judgy to me, which I guess, maybe that's part of the work research does, but just help us understand that a bit more, this belief, behavior, and who are we to say someone's not behaving right based on their beliefs?
Sure. Well, at least in research, we would say that behaviors are a better indication or a more accurate indication of belief. So we try to measure behaviors because that would give us a better indication of their beliefs.
And so we're believing what they're saying about their behaviors.
I mean, we have desirability bias too and response bias, right? Like the idea that, you try to make yourself look a little better than you really are.
Yes.
So it's more accurate to say, to really root it in a behavior. In the last 4 weeks, how many times did you read your Bible versus do you read your Bible? And people are going to say yes.
Okay. That's interesting. Okay. That's helpful.
I think, too, as researchers, it's not that we're making moral judgments about people. When we're talking about finding evangelicals, we're trying to decide, are you an evangelical or not? And so it's more of a classification section than a moral judgment. There are many fine and upstanding moral people who are not evangelicals, right? What we are trying to do is to decide, when we study evangelicals, should you be part of the population that we're looking at or not?
Okay. So let's talk about the famous Bebbington's quadrilateral, which I learned about long after it was, entrenched a few years ago as I was trying to understand this community. Is that still in vogue? Maybe we need to explain it to any listener who might not know, but is that still a helpful tool to understand evangelicals?
Whether it's helpful or not, it is still in wide use. So it's still referenced. So he has this 4-part paradigm for understanding evangelicals, and he's a historian. So Bebbington looked at, 200 years of evangelicals, essentially, and identified these 4 common features. And just up front, too, this was in Britain. So it's a largely Western and white and European expression of evangelicalism. And he identified these 4 sides of his quadrilateral, which is biblicism, this sort of particular regard for the Bible; activism, which is the expression of your beliefs through effort or action; crucicentrism, a stress or emphasis on the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross; and then conversionism. There's this belief that your life needs to be changed in response. And so he identified these 4 essentially pillars of what an evangelical is. And many of these pollsters have tried to operationalize these 4 pillars, these features of evangelicals, to try to identify evangelicals in their population. And, you were asking, is this still useful? What we're realizing is it's not maybe quite as useful as it once was in identifying evangelicals, today at least. And so I don't know if it's necessarily changing these features, but maybe our ways of understanding them and how we measure them in the expression of evangelicalism in the 21st century, it needs to be reevaluated. And there's quite a few other historians and theologians who want to see a little bit more nuance and context in Bebington. So it's been interacted with, but Bebington is by far the most popular and the most referenced.
To be fair to Christians from other traditions who might be listening and thinking, I have a high regard for the Bible, Bebington wasn't saying that other Christian traditions don't have a teaching about all of these things or that they're not important. But in the kind of his British understated way, he would say that they have a peculiar emphasis on these things. And so evangelicals are peculiar in the emphasis or stress that they put on these 4 items.
I find the life changed as a response forth interesting, and I don't know, it's actually kind of moving to me, but again, seems really difficult to pin down and define. I think what a changed life would look like. Is there agreement on what a changed life looks like?
I don't know whether Babington tries to define that or other people do. So usually the way that we get at that is we ask people about whether they've had a conversion experience. So whether that's the best way to do it, this is part of the questions that we're raising in a paper that Lindsay and I are writing. But it is this idea that, have you committed your life to Christ? Have you had a conversion experience? Are you born again? These are different ways that pollsters have tried to get at that. But you're right. It is a very personal, individualized kind of thing. And what you're trying to do as a pollster or as a researcher is find a very general way that's going to find most of the people most of the time.
I'm coming back to the word performative. And I know you, in your paper, you touch on the work of Sam Reimer, researcher from Crandall University in Moncton, of course, and an author. He talks about performative and some of the problems with that. And I find myself, well, first of all, can you define performative so we can be clear on what we mean by that? And then I find myself somewhat stumped as to why someone would want to be performative when evangelicals are so unpopular. But I may be making a link that isn't really there.
Yeah, so terms always have their context, and right, often when we say performative, that sounds like a bad thing, and that's not what Sam or Abby Day or
thank
other
you.
people mean.
Okay, help us.
So it's not that they're disingenuous or when he says that they're performative, but rather they're switching the emphasis. If you're saying something performatively and something like Jesus Christ died on the cross for my sins, if you say that you agree with that, what Sam Reimer and Abby Day are saying is that that may be an indication that you belong to a group that says those kinds of things. It is a way of sort of running up a flag rather than perhaps that you have thought through this as systematic theology and come to a deep-seated agreement with that. And so it's the way that doctrine works differently. And what they say is the difference in the way that people are answering that is they say some people are theocentric. When they think about this, they are thinking about God, and other people are anthropocentric, where they're thinking about humans and human relationships. And so when you you give your affirmation to a doctrinal statement from an anthropocentric point of view, then that is about belonging. When you do it from a theocentric point of view, that is about your belief in God. And so you could think of it this way, that it's about signaling which group you belong to, whether you're belonging first to God. And as Christians, we would say by extension, that means the church. But when you're thinking of it anthropocentrically, then what you're saying, first of all, is I belong to a group of people.
And in one group of people, like in one typical evangelical church, I'm assuming that you can have people in both camps, if there are only two camps. Like you can have people assenting to belief for very different reasons based on what you've just said.
Yes, that's right.
So does that make church harder?
It makes identifying evangelicals harder because now we have to decide which kind of evangelical are we talking about and which kind of evangelical do we want to study. And that's not a judgment on anybody's moral character or whatever. It's a matter of precision in research and in the representations that we make about evangelicals.
That is so interesting. And so you get to that conclusion by asking precise questions, I guess, or layers of questions.
What we were thinking, I mean, this hasn't been operationalized, so we haven't really formulated any questions that would get at this. But what we're thinking is we need to formulate questions that don't maybe recall the language that they would identify with or associate with their belonging, and try to think of a formulation in which they have to think about maybe the orientation of their belief. Is it more toward belonging, or is it more toward God in that theocentric way? And so we're suggesting, let's start a conversation about how to do this. I don't know. I mean, Rick, maybe you have some suggestions, but I think we've really trying to just raise the concern of maybe we need to adjust our approach.
And so what Sam would say is that, the way that you tell whether someone is theocentric or anthropocentric has to do with what their locus of authority is. And really what Sam is talking about is whether your locus of authority tends to be outside of yourself or inside of yourself. And if it's outside of yourself, you might locate that in the Bible, which is a book outside of yourself, or in your church and its teachings outside of yourself, or in the historic creeds. And in the past, especially if we go back to, say, the silent generation or the greatest generation, if we're talking in sociological terms, these were generations that were very externally focused, right? They would talk about doing their duty, doing their bit, and they didn't sort of question why. More recently, we tend to say, well, I will stand in judgment on X, Y, or Z. It's not just about church. We go to the doctor and the doctor gives us a diagnosis, and we go to the internet and now we're looking it up for a second opinion, right? And self-diagnosing. And this is the idea that I am the best judge in all of these matters, whether it's medicine, whether it's theology, whether it's psychology. And so if we're trying to tease this out, there are different questions that researchers have used in the past, like what I believe about Christianity is more important than what is taught by any church. Now, do you see that puts what I believe against what the church believes, and how you answer that question can be an indication, for example, of where your locus of authority is. And there are other questions, but these are some of the ways that you might go about it.
So as I hear you explaining this, I was thinking, if it's about locus of authority, which I understand, and I'm thinking about the number of younger, maybe Christians, evangelicals specifically perhaps, who are deconstructing. We hear that term a lot, and maybe even leaving the church or changing traditions. Like sometimes it's evangelicals shifting off into maybe a more mainline denomination or whatever, the reverse trend. But does the internal locus of authority change or is more vulnerable, let's say, or more open to deconstruction than the external locus of authority?
So the short answer I think is yes. And part of this goes back to, where does the idea that I should be the authority in my life come from? In sort of a 2-minute answer, this goes back to the Enlightenment and philosophers like Rousseau, who said that man is by nature good, nature being a good, and only society has made him bad. And it's the idea that evil comes from outside of us and it oppresses us. It manifests itself in government, in religion, and in our families. And if everything outside of me is bad or potentially corrupting, then if what's left to be good is me. And there's a lot of cultural reasons why this has suddenly become more plausible in our day. But most people who trace this back, we'll trace it back to Rousseau and that time period. And there's a lot of really good reasons why Rousseau posited this, because there were a lot of problems in the church. There were a lot of problems in government. There was a lot of abuse of authority. And I think that if you look at the news today, our news stories are just one litany of abuse of authority after another. This becomes a rational, plausible response to locate what is virtuous in myself.
This question is going to seem like it's coming from left field probably, but I want to make sure we touch on it. I don't hear the word fundamentalist used a lot anymore, but are they still out there?
Well, one historian defines a fundamentalist as sort of a militant evangelical who has Baptist and dispensational leanings. That's George Marsden. I'm not sure it's a label that is necessarily owned. It's maybe more assigned for those who you don't agree with and you think are a little bit too hard-lined in some areas. But it had an historical function and a place. But I was actually just reading yesterday that the fundamentalist movement maybe wasn't as potent in Canada. So at least for measuring evangelical Canadians, it might not be as useful in our context to identify fundamentalists who would probably be considered more of a subset of evangelicalism. But it's really kind of associated more with a militant and more combative approach to their faith and to maybe even the public expression of their faith. There have been operationalizations or ways of maybe potentially identifying fundamentalists through surveys, but you could do that. It's not always helpful.
One of the ways that it's been proposed that you could distinguish between evangelicals and fundamentalists is through transdenominationalism. This is the idea that you would work cooperatively with people in other denominations or traditions. And, famously, Billy Graham, who became known as an evangelical, he was an evangelical largely because he would work with other denominations even outside of the evangelical movement on his crusades. And that was one of the sort of the distinguishing features that made him an evangelical instead of a fundamentalist.
So when we talk about this, I immediately think about the differences between the movements or the groups between the States and Canada. That Canadian evangelicals seem to me to be usually distinct from their American cousins or whatever. And I know there's been lots of examination about that in recent years. And the book, which I have not read, but I've read about it, Jesus and John Wayne, for example, really tells a story of the American evangelical movement that was probably a little bit alarming or certainly set off a whole bunch of discussions. So does that have an impact in Canada? Are we shaped by those conversations?
I think we certainly are, but there have been quite a few people who've studied evangelicalism in Canada and have just, I think by nature of, we have other influences than just the United States. We have more British influence. So evangelicalism isn't going to look the same as a movement or even as a type in Canada. We also, a large part of Canada's evangelical population is from immigrant populations as well. So we are going to also have some more global influence in the expression of evangelicalism in Canada. All that said, there's quite a bit of media portrayal of evangelicalism that is tied to the States. And so I think Canadian evangelicals are certainly impacted by perceptions that would tie what an evangelical is to an understanding of how evangelicalism is expressed in the United States. Some of our polls have not been the most helpful in doing that. I always refer to, there's that famous stat from Pew that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in 2016. But if you actually look at that stat, they asked people to self-identify as evangelical or born again. And whoever said yes to that question and was white was considered a white evangelical, but the population was much broader than evangelicals. You had Catholics in there, you had Latter-day Saints. And so the way that evangelicals are measured, the definition that is being used is going to affect the perception. And if the definition is not precise, unfortunately, the perception is not nuanced either. And true evangelicals and Canadian evangelicals, by extension, are affected.
I think, too, that the gospel is always enculturated and our cultural situation changes us. Even if you go back when Canada was established as a nation state, and, I'm talking primarily among settler Christians here in Canada now, but we didn't have the same kind of rugged individual myth about Canadians that the Americans do, the self-made man who, pull yourself up from your bootstraps. Rather, the settlers came in and they landed on the prairies, and if they didn't cooperate, the winter was just going to kill them. And so it was much more of a cooperative outlook, and we've always had more of a sense that we needed each other. And you see it in our it's not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's peace, order, and good government. And these are the kinds of things that you needed just even to survive in Canada. And this shapes, I think, the outlook of Canadians and Canadian evangelicals as well. And I think, too, Canada was formed just after the American Revolution, or not the American Revolution, sorry, it was the Civil War. And Canadians looked to the South and they saw Americans slaughter 250,000 of their own people, and they were horrified, and they decided that, we better band together to do something a little bit differently. And even, after the Second World War, the Massey Commission was called, and the Massey Commission was to deal with twin threats. It was the threat of communism and the threat of American cultural imperialism. And out of that, we got CBC Television, the National Film Board, CanCon requirements. And I think it's just instructive to think that we saw something in the United States that we thought we needed to protect ourselves from. And that shaped all of Canada, and it set us on a course where we were very self-consciously trying to define ourselves over and against the United States. And that impulse has always been there.
I think I see how complicated this is and how tricky to define evangelical and figure out the best way to do that. So I know you two in your work, you have recommendations around the Christian evangelical scale. That's part of what you're digging into here. Can you summarize for us where you're going with this?
Sure. Well, our first recommendation really is that we identify evangelicals through beliefs and behaviors, because that gives us the freedom to kind of offer that contextual and theological nuance that just asking, do you self-identify as an evangelical? That just doesn't do. And then it gives us a little bit more latitude than just asking for their denominational affiliation, which, some denominations might have evangelicals within them, but not be tied to the historic movement. And so there's just lots of weaknesses there. So we do want to advocate for primarily measuring and defining evangelicals by their beliefs and behaviors.
I think we're also looking to have some determination of whether you have an internal or external locus of authority, because we think that that's a key part to help us decide whether, when people answer doctrinal statements, are they being performative in doing that? And that, again, that's not a bad thing to be performative. It's about identifying with a group rather than identifying it with a belief in God or not. And we think that there also should be more measures of actual behavior, because it's a different thing to say that you think something is important than to actually behave in such a way that would demonstrate that it's important.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I find myself after this conversation self-examining and thinking, how am I internal or externally located in terms of authority? And it's a very interesting question. How will this work that you're doing now impact other research that's coming down the road, or, contribute to the research community in Canada?
So we've been in discussions with a small group of people, including Andrew Granville, who developed the Christian Evangelical Scale, about revisiting it and revising it to take into account the kinds of things that we've talked about in this conversation. So we are working towards a symposium or a consultation where we would bring together some of the best scholars and ministry practitioners in Canada to talk about how we could do this better. And then we hope to test it and verify it and then make it available for others to use. And certainly it is our plan internally here to use that scale when it's revised so that we can better identify evangelicals. And so the validity of what we are learning as we study evangelicals will be higher.
As Rick said in the beginning, the more precision that we can have means we can have more precision in our research, in our ministry research, and we can serve our affiliates and evangelicals better ultimately.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Rick and Lindsay.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks for listening to this intentionally ad-free podcast. Find out more about the EFC's research and how you can support it with a donation at theefc.ca/research.